Great Katana is one of my favorite weapons, the new additions to the DLC, the Shadow of the Tree. This has always been very powerful. There's 3 Great Katanas in the DLC, and all of them have their strengths and weaknesses. The major strength of the Great Katana is that it can change the Ash of War to use meta Ashes of War onto this Great Katana. They buffed recently the overhead stance. I've always thought that the overhead stance has been nice, but now it's a little bit bad. They increase the damage, and yeah, it's a little bit more, but it still does what it's supposed to do, so let's actually talk about it. It has decent damage. It has 2 damage possibilities, one for light input and the second one for heavy input. It is a stance kind of attack that is going to benefit from Relentless Cameo, but we'll talk about that in a little while later. Now the stance damage, it's not really nothing that special. It has 11 stance damage on light inputs of the Ash of War, and it has 22 stance damage on heavy inputs of the Ash of War. That being said, that's the beauty of this Ash of War, the versatility that you can have right here. With the regular basic attacks, with the properly built or buffed character, the regular light inputs, it's going to range in between 1.5 to 2k damage, which is not too shabby, and then the heavy one is going to be from 20.5 to 3.5, 4k damage, give it or take. But the thing is that you can use it on depending on the needs to punish the enemy that you're fighting against. Because if you get familiar to a very specific attack animation of the boss that you are fighting against, you can, for example, use a shield, and at the time that you have some recovery frames for the enemy that the boss needs to perform before they can continue the assault, because they do have to pause sometimes here and there, you can decide whether you're going to be using the light attack, the light Ash of War, or the heavy Ash of War. So in reality, it's just an alteration of the regular basic light attacks and heavy attacks of the weapon that you can alter with one single input, and that it's something that it can punish many things. Because like I said, when the boss finishes a very heavy AoE where they have lots of recovery frames that they are not that bad, that they are not that fast, that's when you can use the heavies. Also, one amazing thing about this weapon is that it has native bleeding, meaning that you can make this weapon occult and have like 110 bleeding, and because of the heavy overhead stance, it's 3 hits in a row. More often than not, in 2 inputs of that thing is going to cause the insta bleeding right there, which is just nuts amazing, and I love that about this weapon. These are the stats that we have for our character right here. Vigor 50, Mind 20. It doesn't use that much FP costs, as a matter of fact. It only has 8 FP cost for the light attack. Heavy, it's 10. And then we have Endurance 23. The weapon, it is to some extent heavy, but not as much. It just has the regular weight of a claimer, which is really not that bad. Strength and Dexterity, these are weapon requirements right there. Faith 15 to be able to use the buffs that we're using with this character right here. 80 Arcane, this is a concession, and a lot of people are going to be wondering, isn't it just better to increase the blood loss build up on the cap for Arcane at 55 and then move over to Dexterity? Not necessarily, because here we're actually using Arcane to scale the damage of the weapon. Right now it has 700 AR. If you, for example, were to make this weapon a keen weapon based on Dexterity, which is what the basic scaling is and what the best scaling is going to possibly be, and you have, like, for example, 88 Dexterity, it's still going to retain 700 AR, which is nuts. It's amazing damage for a Great Katana. That being said, if you have that, you have like 55 blood buildup. With a occult katana, you have the same amount of AR, but you also have blood loss buildup. Why would you want to use, for example, a Dexterity one instead of this right here? If you would be, for example, a higher level character that can imbue the weapon, or you're using Royal Greases, the greases actually increase damage quite a lot. So if you're using one of those greases or incantations or spells to buff your weapon that would give you like 200 damage, then yes, it's just better to go for the dexterity route. But right now, since we are 150 builds, this is the most damage output that we can reach right now. For the equipment, we're using the Occult Great Katana. This increases our blood loss buildup by 108. Then we have the Wakizashi. I like to use Bloodhound Step in here just because whenever there's a huge AoE, I like to be able to dodge it with the Bloodhound Step. The shield, it's not necessary, but Mesmer Soldier Shield is like a staple at this point in the channel. It's very versatile, it has nice guard boost, and it barely has any requirements, so it's really nice. For the seal, we're using a seal just because buffing a character, it's a thing. And remember that for the armor, you want to be using something that will allow you to bypass the 51 points thresholds, so that you wouldn't get staggered by every single thing out there. We're using the Ronis's armor, and then the Knight's Cavalry gauntlets, the Grips of Solitude. Here it looks like a Ronin samurai kind of thing, and it has 53 points, so that's actually kind of nice. For the Talismans, we have a little bit of a concessions to make around here and there. I don't think that I like Relenna's cameo as much as I used to like it when the DLC got launched. That it's a flat native 20% more damage whenever you're using a Ash of War and you're charging it for 1 second. It's very useful for exploration, but more often than not when you're fighting against bosses, you immediately want to take advantage of those recovery frames that they do after they perform an attack. So more often than not, you do not have that extra second to wait for the stance to happen, but if you do want to use it, be my guest, you can. We have the Shadow of Alexander right here to increase our damage by 15% more. We're using the Archer's Favorite +2 as a must with the gear that I showcase you. That's going to allow you to medium roll. If you not use it, then you might as well place a little bit more points into endurance, because you're either going to fat roll if you don't do such a thing. If you want to be using heavier armor, the greater arsenal, and usually just the regular talismans that you would regularly be using for the general purposes of survivability and supplementary kind of things like the turtle talisman, the dragon crest, things like that and what have you. We don't really have extra percentage on fire damage that we can take advantage of, but we do have actually quite a bit of physical damage. Flame Grant Me Strength gives you 20% extra flat damage to physical damage, and what do you know, we have actually quite a bit of that. So this is in reality giving us like 100-ish, 150-ish points into just pure physical damage, which is always really appreciated. That's why we have our Fate on 15 to be able to use this bad boy right here, and then Golden Bow is going to give us damage negation, but also extra 15% more attack power that it's going to stack with the Flame Grant Me Strength. Granted, we don't actually have the Fate requirement for us to be able to use Golden Bow, but that is why we're using a very specific Cerulean Tia. We're using the Fate Not Crystal Tia to increase our faith so that we can use Golden Bow, and I'd say that's a must. That's the only thing that I consider for it to be a must in here. And then the other one, it's just the regular things that you would generally use. For example, the Green Burst Crystal Tier, it's also one of my favorites. The Crimson Burst Crystal Tier, the Upline Bubble Tier. You might be wondering, the Stone Barb Crack Tier to increase the poise damage that we deal to the enemy. The weapon Ash of War doesn't really necessarily have that much stance damage. However, since it does have like that advantage of being able to attack the enemy more often right after they perform an attack, usually to use an Ash of War, you have to be very careful and know when are you going to have enemies recovery frames for you to be able to cast the Ash of War and not trade damage. This case scenario, you can be trading damage because the light input is actually quite nice. You would have to, for example, perform like 8 attacks to be able, because of the 11 stance damage, 8 attacks to be able to break the stance of the enemy. And if you can tone down to 6, for example, with the Stone Bar Crack Tier, it's an extra consequential little something that is always going to be really appreciated, especially if you use it with the heavy portion of the Ash of War. That's actually going to give us quite a bit of damage and stance damage as well. So it is a very powerful Ash of War on a very powerful, versatile weapon. I'd still say that there's better Ashes of War that you can allocate in here to your Great Katana, But it's a nice little buff that you have right here that it increases the damage a little bit. It's nothing too crazy, but it's a very round weapon that it has lots of tools because of the high damage that you have, the high bleeding build-up that you have right here. The overhead stance is amazing to proc bleeding into the enemy. Sometimes, depending on resistances and depending on if the enemy bleeds or not, you can be proccing at around 3 times the bleeding on the enemy, and if you don't proc the bleed onto the enemy, the damage is still quite decent. Although, I would say that there's still better Ashes of War that you would allocate in here. It's just that this is a little extra buffed little something that it could make a difference on whether should you want to be using the overhead stance. I think that the buff was very much needed because there's many Ashes of War that are still, I'd say that are still better than this one. But now it's a fun Ash of War to use that is going to proc bleeding quite often. Anyways, if you like the content, like and never super appreciate it. And also, you're the orgulloso beautiful person, you're the orgulloso beautiful person. Subscribe to the channel, give this beautiful day, and goodbye.